The year was 1876, and the wind across the Kansas plains carried more than dust. It carried whispers of opportunity and the unmistakable scent of danger. Dodge City, perched along the Santa Fe Trail, had grown from a lonely trading post into the very image of the American frontier's contradictions: promise and peril, prosperity and bloodshed. It was a place where the clang of spurs echoed against wooden boardwalks, and the rattle of poker chips mingled with the jingle of six guns resting on a gambler's hip. To step into Dodge was to step into a world forever teetering between civilization and chaos. At first, Dodge City was little more than a collection of huts and tents, rising beside Fort Dodge in the early 1870s. But the arrival of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad changed everything. Suddenly, the town was not just a dusty outpost, but a bustling hub on the cattle trail. Herds driven up from Texas poured into its stockyards, and with them came the cowboys, young, rough, hungry for drink, women, and the fleeting comfort of wages squandered in a single night. In the space of a few years, Dodge transformed into what the Eastern newspapers would soon call the wickedest little city in America. Yet it wasn't only cattle that fed Dodge's wild spirit. Before the cowboys, there were the buffalo hunters. In the early 1870s, thousands of hides passed through Dodge, stripped from the endless herds that once darkened the plains. Men came with sharps rifles and dreams of quick fortune, leaving behind mountains of bones and the slow destruction of the buffalo nations that had sustained the plains tribes for centuries. With the railroad ready to ship hides eastward, Dodge City became both slaughterhouse and marketplace. The air smelled of blood, hides, and whiskey, and with each wagon load of wealth, another outlaw, another drifter, and another man with nothing to lose arrived at the edge of town. By day, Dodge hummed with trade, cattle bawling in the yards and wagons creaking down Front Street. By night, lamps flickered inside saloons like the Long Branch or the Alhambra, where gamblers, dance hall girls, and hired guns mingled in a haze of smoke and spilled liquor. It was in these places that reputations were made or lost at the shuffle of a deck or the drawing of a revolver. A glance too long, an insult muttered, or a hand straying toward a holster could mean the difference between walking out alive or being carried out into the prairie dust. The law here was thin, stretched taut like the wire of a telegraph. A sheriff's badge was little more than a target to those who refused to bow to it. Men like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Charlie Bassett would eventually wear the star. But even their names carried no guarantee of peace. Dodge City's lawmen lived with a single truth: order could only be bought with steel, lead, and the rope. It is here, at the threshold between dream and nightmare, that the hangman's rope first cast its shadow. In Dodge, the gallows was not merely a structure of wood and hemp. It was a promise that wrongs, whether real or imagined, would be answered. For the frightened citizen, it was reassurance. For the reckless outlaw, it was a warning. And for those caught in between, it was a question hanging heavy in the dry Kansas air. Would justice come with a gavel, or would it come with a noose? The town's reputation spread quickly. To the east, Dodge was seen as a den of vice and violence, a place where a man could vanish as quickly as a coin slipped across a poker table. To the cowboys of Texas, it was a glittering prize at the end of the trail, a place where their months of hardship might dissolve in whiskey and laughter, if only for a night. But for those who called Dodge home, life was an endless balancing act. Merchants and ranchers wanted stability. Saloons and gamblers thrived on chaos. And in the middle of it all, ordinary families tried to carve a life out of the dust, raising children in a town where gunfire after midnight was as common as a rooster crowing at dawn. And so Dodge City stood as a paradox, a magnet for wealth and ambition, and a crucible of blood and fear. It was a place where fortunes could be made in a single hand of cards, and where men could lose their lives in less time than it took to draw a breath. Here in the Queen of the Cow Towns, the line between civilization and savagery was as thin as the hemp rope coiled behind the sheriff's office, waiting, silent, and patient. It is in this crucible that our story unfolds. For when law faltered and tempers blazed, the citizens of Dodge knew one thing: the hangman's rope was always ready, and frontier justice waited for no man. If Dodge City was the Queen of the Cow Towns by day, then by night it was a monarch draped in whiskey, smoke, and the laughter of gamblers who knew luck could turn as quick as the spin of a roulette wheel. The town's beating heart was not its churches or its schools, though both existed in fragile form, but its saloons, dozens of them, strung like lanterns along Front Street. To the weary cowboy, these were havens of release after months on the trail. To the gambler, they were theaters of fortune. And to the outlaw, they were hunting grounds where a careless hand or a boastful word could mark a man for death. The most famous of these establishments was the Long Branch Saloon, a polished wooden palace where cowboys rubbed shoulders with gamblers and dance hall girls in ruffled skirts. There, poker games stretched deep into the night, fueled by whiskey poured from bottles stacked like ammunition behind the bar. The Long Branch became legendary not merely for its games, but for the figures who frequented it. Lawmen like Bat Masterson, who was as skilled at cards as he was with his Colt, or visiting gunmen eager to test their mettle in a town where reputation was currency. But for every Long Branch with its polished bar and lively music, there were rougher places where the air smelled of sweat and spilled beer, and the patrons carried knives hidden in their boots. The Alhambra, the Occidental, and the Lady Gay each had their reputations, some for music, others for brawls that ended with blood soaking into sawdust floors. Every door that swung open was a gamble in itself. Step inside and one might find laughter and friendship, or insults and pistols drawn. Women played their part in this theater of survival and vice. Known politely as soiled doves, they worked in dance halls and upstairs rooms, offering companionship for a price. Some came willingly, hoping for a fresh start in the frontier towns. Others arrived by desperation, poverty, or coercion. In Dodge, their presence was both tolerated and scorned. Citizens with families decried the saloons as dens of sin, but the economy of the town relied heavily on the money those establishments drew. It was whispered that Dodge's prosperity rested as much on the backs of its women as it did on the hooves of cattle driven north from Texas. Violence was the natural companion of vice. Whiskey-fueled disputes erupted with alarming regularity, and tempers flared faster than the barkeep could pour another round. A gambler accused of cheating might find himself staring down the barrel of a six-shooter, the rattle of chips replaced by the deafening crack of gunfire. Cowboys, flush with wages, sometimes fought over women or over nothing at all. A shove, a word too sharp, or a glance held too long could end in a fatal draw in the middle of Front Street. Dodge became notorious for its shootouts, though not all were as romantic as dime novels suggested. Many ended quickly, with a single shot fired across a saloon table. Others spilled into the dusty streets, where crowds gathered in grim fascination, watching as reputations were settled with gun smoke. The survivors became legends whispered about for years. While the dead were buried in Boot Hill Cemetery, their markers simple wood, their names soon forgotten. Lawmen were never far from these saloons, but their presence was not always enough to prevent bloodshed. Wyatt Earp himself once remarked that the greatest challenge of Dodge City was not catching criminals, but keeping drunken cowboys from killing one another before sunrise. The infamous deadline, a railroad track running through town, was enforced to keep the worst vices on one side, away from families and churches. But men with whiskey in their veins rarely respected lines, and the law's authority was constantly tested. One often overlooked feature of Dodge's saloon culture was its mixture of classes and cultures. Alongside cowboys and gamblers were Mexican vaqueros who brought cattle-driving traditions north, African-American soldiers, and buffalo hunters seeking respite, and occasional native men trading or drinking despite the deep hostility of the age. In Dodge, the saloon was both melting pot and powder keg. It reflected the broader tensions of the frontier, where opportunity clashed with prejudice, and violence was the common language of dispute. Every night seemed to dance along the edge of disaster. Candlelight flickered against stained glass windows. Piano music stumbled through the haze, and somewhere in the crowd, eyes watched for weakness. A gambler might smile across the table, his fingers brushing the butt of his revolver beneath the cloth. A cowboy might drain his whiskey and slam the glass down too hard, drawing the attention of men ready to prove their steel. And in that moment, the hangman's rope outside the sheriff's office grew just a little tighter, waiting for the dawn when another name might be added to its tally. To the townsfolk of Dodge, this was the price of prosperity. The cattle drives brought money, and money drew gamblers, saloon owners, and women of the night. but all of them together created a storm that few lawmen could ever fully control. Some citizens whispered of cleaning up Dodge, of driving out the saloons and their vices, but most knew that without them, the town would wither. And so, night after night, the cycle repeated. Drunken laughter, sharp disputes, pistols flashing, and the sheriff dragging another man off to the cells to await his fate. And hovering above it all was the quiet certainty that justice in Dodge City was never far away. For some, it would come with a stern warning and a night in the jailhouse. For others, it would come with a trial before a weary judge. But for the most unfortunate, or the most reckless, it would come with the crack of a trap door and the tightening of a noose, as the citizens of Dodge gathered to watch justice served in the only language the frontier truly understood. As the nights of Dodge City grew longer and wilder, so too did the citizens' hunger for order. It was one thing to tolerate drunken brawls in a saloon. It was another to let thieves, murderers, and desperados roam free under the prairie sun. And in the absence of strong courts, in a town where the sheriff was often outnumbered 10-1, the noose became not just a tool of punishment, but the very embodiment of frontier justice. The hangman's rope was simple, hemp, coarse, and unforgiving, but in Dodge, it carried the weight of law itself. There were times when trials were arranged with a semblance of order. Judges rode circuit, hearing cases in makeshift courtrooms where juries of merchants and ranchers delivered verdicts. But more often than not, the law moved faster than the courts, and the people themselves demanded satisfaction. One such case that echoed through the prairie was the capture of two cattle rustlers, Kelly and Thompson. These men, seasoned thieves, were caught with stolen stock belonging to a local rancher. In a city where cattle was lifeblood, such theft was more than a crime. It was an assault on survival itself. When the two were dragged into Dodge, the air bristled with fury. Citizens filled the street, voices rising in anger. Some shouted for a trial, but others, their patience worn thin, shouted louder. "String them up!" A crude gallows was quickly assembled, rough timbers nailed together in haste. There was no waiting for a judge, no plea from an attorney. At dawn, with the prairie wind cold against their faces, Kelly and Thompson were led forward. The crowd was thick with ranchers, townsfolk, and cowboys, all watching as the nooses were placed around their necks. Some said the sheriff turned his face away. Others claimed he gave the nod himself. Either way, the outcome was certain. The trapdoor fell, the ropes went taut, and the two rustlers swung in the morning light. Their deaths were met not with silence but with cheers. Justice, the citizens believed, had been done. Yet such scenes were double-edged. For every thief or killer who met their end on the gallows, there were whispers of men less guilty, or even innocent, who shared the same fate. Dodge was not alone in this. Across Kansas, vigilante committees formed whenever the courts seemed too slow, their members cloaked in self-righteous authority. In the mining camps of Colorado, in the cattle towns of Texas, in the railroad camps stretching west, ropes dangled from cottonwoods or hastily built gallows, reminders that the frontier did not always wait for law. To many citizens, public hangings served a purpose beyond punishment. They were deterrents. Grim theater meant to warn every would-be outlaw that crime in Dodge City carried only one end. Families brought children to watch, merchants closed their shops, and crowds gathered in silence or celebration as men swung from the rope. It was said the very sight of a hanging could tame the wildest impulses, if only for a while. But others saw darker truths. Some historians suggest these public spectacles fed more than justice. They fed bloodlust, a hunger for control in a world where life was cheap and violence a daily companion. Consider the case of a man accused of murder after a card game went wrong. Some swore he shot in self-defense. Others claimed he had drawn first. He was hauled to the gallows anyway, his pleas drowned out by the roar of the crowd. His body swung while questions lingered in the dust. Justice or vengeance? In Dodge, the line was as thin as a strand of hemp. For the Plains tribes who watched these proceedings from the margins of the frontier, such justice must have seemed both alien and cruel. Among many native nations, justice was rooted in restitution or reconciliation rather than execution. But in Dodge City, the gallows carried the full might of Euro-American frontier culture, where punishment was swift and final. The rope was not just a tool of order, It was a symbol of dominance, of a civilization determined to impose its rule by fear as much as by law. Boot Hill Cemetery, resting on a rise outside town, became the final destination for many who felt the hangman's embrace. Its name said it all: men buried with their boots still on, cut down in violence rather than laid down in peace. Wooden markers leaned in the prairie wind, carved with crude inscriptions or none at all. To walk among them was to see the price of Dodge's prosperity, row upon row of men who had gambled, stolen, or simply crossed the wrong man at the wrong time. But while some praised the gallows as a guardian of order, others feared what it revealed. If justice could be delivered by a mob's demand, then who among them was safe? Merchants who spoke against saloon owners, ranchers accused of cutting the wrong fence, even lawmen themselves. Any could find the rope tightening around their neck if the crowd turned. The rope was impartial, not in fairness, but in its lack of mercy. Still, in Dodge City, the hangman's rope endured. It was the frontier's crude solution to a problem that civilization had not yet solved. Where the courts were weak, the rope was strong. Where the law hesitated, the rope was decisive. And so, as cattle herds poured into town and the saloons filled with gamblers and gunmen, the citizens of Dodge lived with the knowledge that order was never more than a gallows away. In the rising heat of a Kansas morning, with the smell of cattle heavy in the air and the creak of rope echoing across the yard, Dodge City reminded its citizens and strangers alike that the West was no place for hesitation. Here, justice did not wait for gavel or jury. It swung from the hangman's rope. If the hangman's rope was the symbol of Dodge City's frontier justice, then the men who carried tin stars were its living embodiment. They walked the boardwalks with 6 guns at their hips, their eyes scanning every saloon door, every shadowed alley, knowing that one wrong move could turn the night into blood. They were called marshals, sheriffs, peace officers, but their task was anything but peaceful. To keep Dodge City from drowning in lawlessness required a certain breed of man, half gunfighter, half diplomat, willing to play poker in the afternoon and risk his life by midnight. Wyatt Earp, perhaps the most legendary of them all, cut a tall, lean figure in Dodge City during the late 1870s. He wasn't yet the hero of Tombstone, nor the man immortalized in dime novels. In Dodge, Wyatt was still a working deputy, patrolling streets where every drunken cowboy seemed eager to test him. He carried himself with a calmness that unnerved would-be challengers. When trouble broke out, and it always did, Wyatt preferred to use his fists before his gun. Yet when the Colt was drawn, he was steady, deliberate, and unflinching. In a town where hesitation meant death, Wyatt's restraint became his greatest weapon. Bat Masterson, another name etched into frontier lore, was cut from a different cloth. Shorter, stockier, with a gambler's grin and a taste for risk, Bat was as comfortable at the card table as he was enforcing the law. He had already earned scars from the Battle of Adobe Walls, where buffalo hunters clashed with Comanche and Kiowa warriors, and those scars gave him an air of experience that Dodge respected. As sheriff, Bat tried to bring a touch of order, but his nights were often spent in the same saloons he was sworn to police. To some, this made him corruptible. To others, it made him human. Either way, Bat knew the town's pulse, and the town knew that when Bat Masterson stepped into the street, trouble was about to be resolved, one way or another. Charlie Bassett, less remembered but no less important, served as Dodge's first sheriff and later its marshal. Bassett was pragmatic, often overshadowed by the flamboyance of Earp and Masterson, yet he built the foundation of law enforcement in the town. He was the one who trained deputies, wrote reports, and tried to hold together a force that was as transient as the town itself. Deputies came and went, lured away by gambling winnings, cattle contracts, or the sheer exhaustion of trying to tame Dodge City. Bassett's steady hand kept the office alive when chaos threatened to tear it apart. Yet even the best lawmen knew they couldn't rely on their stars alone. They needed allies, men they trusted to stand shoulder to shoulder in a fight. Wyatt Earp had his brothers. Bat Masterson relied on fellow gamblers who respected his authority. Sometimes the lawman and the outlaw were separated only by the tilt of a badge. Many peace officers of Dodge had once lived as buffalo hunters, gamblers, or even hired guns. The line was blurred, and the citizens of Dodge knew it. But they accepted it, Because in a town as wild as theirs, sometimes only a man who understood lawlessness could hope to control it. The challenges these men faced were endless. Cowboys poured into town after long cattle drives, pockets full of wages, tempers stoked by trail hardships. Gambling disputes flared into knife fights. Saloon owners demanded protection. Merchants begged for stability. And all the while, outlaws drifted through Dodge, eager to carve their names into the town's bloody legend. To be a lawman was to stand between all these forces, with only a six-shooter and reputation to hold the line. Reputation was currency. Wyatt Earp's calm demeanor, Bat Masterson's scars, Bassett's steady leadership, all carried weight. A lawman didn't have to draw his gun every time. Often it was enough to step into a saloon, lay a hand on his Colt, and let silence speak. But when force became necessary, it was swift. Dodge lawmen did not have the luxury of hesitation. If a man went for his gun, he had to be stopped before he fired. More than one cowboy, flushed with whiskey courage, learned this lesson at the cost of his life. Still, lawmen weren't saints. Many enjoyed the same vices they were sworn to contain. They gambled, drank, and kept company with the very women the church decried. This hypocrisy fueled rumors, but it also kept them grounded in the world they patrolled. The law of Dodge wasn't written in statutes alone. It was written in relationships, favors, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes justice was flexible. A thief might be whipped instead of hung if the town needed his labor. A gambler might be fined rather than jailed if his presence drew business. But if the crime struck at the heart of Dodge, cattle theft, murder, or the killing of a peace officer, the gallows waited. Violence against lawmen was especially despised. To kill a sheriff or deputy was to challenge the fragile order of the town itself. When such crimes occurred, the response was immediate and merciless. Pauses rode out, guns blazing, to drag the culprit back. The noose was never far behind. It was this ruthless defense of their own that gave Dodge lawmen their fierce reputation across the West. In a world where ordinary citizens feared stepping into the night, these men chose to walk it, and their courage, however flawed, kept Dodge City from descending into anarchy. Legends grew quickly. Stories of Wyatt Earp facing down drunken cowboys without firing a shot, or Bat Masterson calmly finishing a poker hand before breaking up a fight, spread through the saloons like wildfire. Some tales were true, others embellished by dime novelists eager to sell copies back east. But the effect was the same. Dodge City became the stage where lawmen and outlaws played out their deadly dramas, and the hangman's rope stood behind the curtain, ready to fall when the final act ended in blood. In the end, the lawmen of Dodge City weren't trying to create a perfect order. They were trying to buy time. Time for merchants to sell, for ranchers to ship cattle, for families to plant roots. Their work was less about erasing chaos than about managing it, holding it back long enough for Dodge to survive another season. And in this fragile balance, the rope remained the law's ultimate weapon. The lawman carried the star, but the noose carried the final word. Dodge City's reputation as the wickedest little city in America did not rest solely on its saloons or its outlaws. It rested equally on the men who tried to hold it together, men who walked with 6 guns at their sides, who gambled with their lives every night, and who knew that when all else failed, the hangman's rope would speak for them. By the early 1880s, Dodge City had begun to weary of its own reputation. The money from cattle drives and saloons still poured in, but the endless cycle of drunken brawls, shootings, and hangings had worn on the respectable citizens. Merchants wanted peace. Families wanted stability. Even the railroads, once content to profit from the chaos, grew anxious that Dodge's bloody fame threatened business. Something had to give. The flashpoint came in 1883 in what history remembers as the Dodge City War. It was not a war in the traditional sense, no cannon fire, no marching armies, but it revealed the powder keg that Dodge had become. At its heart was a conflict between two factions. On one side, the entrenched saloon owners and their allies, who profited from vice. On the other, reform-minded leaders who wanted to clean up Dodge and give it a veneer of respectability. The trouble began when a local lawman, Alonzo Lon Chamberlain, attempted to enforce stricter ordinances on the town's gambling halls and dance parlors. The move infuriated saloon owner Luke Short, a gambler with a quick hand and a quicker temper. Short was no stranger to violence. He had drifted through Texas and Colorado, leaving behind tales of shootouts and narrow escapes. Now in Dodge, he resisted any attempt to curb his business. Tensions mounted, tempers flared, and soon men began choosing sides. When Chamberlain and his allies tried to drive Short out of town, the gambler responded in kind. He called for reinforcements. Within weeks, Dodge City found itself flooded with familiar names from across the frontier. Wyatt Earp returned, answering Short's call, bringing with him men whose reputations alone could chill a room. Bat Masterson, Doc Holliday, Charlie Bassett. Together they formed what came to be called the Dodge City Peace Commission, though their presence promised anything but peace. Photographs of the commission survive to this day. Grim-faced men in wide-brimmed hats, pistols at their sides, their expressions carved in stone. To the citizens of Dodge, seeing that lineup on the boardwalk must have felt like staring down an army of legends. To some, they were protectors. To others, they were hired guns, defending vice under the guise of law. Either way, the message was clear. Dodge would not be cleaned up without a fight. For weeks, the standoff simmered. Rumors flew of planned ambushes, midnight raids, and saloons ready to erupt in gunfire. Citizens braced for blood in the streets, remembering the countless times when disputes in Dodge had ended with bodies carried out to Boot Hill. Yet strangely, no shots were fired. Perhaps it was the sheer weight of the reputations assembled. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Doc Holliday had lived through enough gunfights to know that an open battle would destroy Dodge as surely as it destroyed lives. Cooler heads prevailed, negotiations dragged on, and eventually a compromise was reached. Luke Short was allowed to stay. The commission disbanded. Dodge City avoided the war that had seemed inevitable. But though the Dodge City War ended without bloodshed, it marked a turning point. For the first time, the town had stared into the abyss of its own legend and recoiled. The citizens realized that constant violence, the endless reliance on rope and revolver, could not sustain a community forever. Families wanted schools, not saloons. Merchants wanted banks, not brawls. Even cattlemen grew tired of risking their herds and their lives in a town teetering on chaos. The shadow of the hangman's rope still loomed, but it no longer seemed sufficient. Dodge had outgrown the crude solutions of its youth. Civilization was pushing westward, bringing with it courts, railroads, newspapers, and investors who would not tolerate a town run by mob justice. The gallows might still stand ready, but Dodge was beginning to realize that law had to be more than a rope swinging in the prairie wind. Still, the Dodge City War left behind a complicated legacy. The Peace Commission, though it never fired a shot, burned itself into Western mythology. Dime novelists and newspapermen seized upon the story, transforming a tense standoff into yet another legend of the Wild West. Readers back east thrilled to the idea of Dodge teetering on the edge of violence. With names like Earp and Holliday ready to unleash hell, the fact that no one died mattered little. The legend was enough. And so Dodge City's identity continued to straddle two worlds. To outsiders, it was the eternal town of gunfighters and hangmen, a place where justice was swift and brutal. To its citizens, it was slowly becoming something else, a town trying to shake off its past, to bury the chaos of its youth in favor of order and respectability. The Dodge City War had shown that the town could choose restraint, even when surrounded by men who had built reputations on violence. It had shown, too, that the hangman's rope was no longer the only answer. But make no mistake, the rope remained. For the frontier was not yet tamed, and Dodge still carried its scars. Outlaws still drifted through, and cattle still thundered up the trail. And every time tempers flared too hot, every time blood spilled too freely, the citizens of Dodge knew the gallows could rise again in the morning sun. It was, after all, the language the frontier understood best. As the 1880s gave way to a new decade, Dodge City was no longer the wild den of vice and violence it had once been. The great cattle drives dwindled, diverted to railheads farther south and west. The buffalo herds were gone, wiped from the plains by hunters and railroads. Families moved in where gamblers once reigned, and the clamor of saloons softened beneath the sound of church bells and schoolhouse lessons. Dodge City was changing, and with it, the shadow of the hangman's rope began to recede. But the memory of that rope never truly left. For a decade, it had been the frontier's most visible symbol of justice. Harsh, immediate, and unyielding. To some, it had brought peace in a time of chaos. To others, it had been a tool of fear, wielded by mobs as often as by law. Its legacy was as tangled as the hemp fibers that once creaked in the Kansas wind. Boot Hill Cemetery, sitting silent on the rise outside town, remained the most haunting testament to the rope's reign. There, men who died with their boots still on lay beneath the prairie grass, their names etched on simple wooden markers or lost altogether. Visitors who walked among those graves decades later spoke of the eerie quiet, the sense that the ground itself remembered the violence of Dodge's youth. Boot Hill became a monument not just to those who died, but to the fragile line between order and anarchy. As Dodge City matured, the rope became less a tool of justice and more a story told, part warning, part legend. Dime novelists in the East spun tales of Dodge as the town where every sunrise brought a new hanging, where sheriffs stood grimly by as mobs demanded blood. The truth was more complicated. Yes, men were hung, and some deserved their fate, but others were victims of vengeance, caught in the whirlwind of a town too impatient for courts and too desperate for order. What survived in memory was not the truth of each case, but the larger myth that Dodge City embodied the rough justice of the frontier, where law and violence walked hand in hand. In this way, the rope became more than hemp and timber. It became a cultural symbol woven into the fabric of how Americans remembered the West. To some, it represented strength, the willingness to act when law was weak. To others, it was barbarity disguised as order, a reminder that fear often masquerades as justice. Historians still debate whether the noose saved Dodge from greater bloodshed or merely perpetuated a cycle of violence. But no one denies its presence, looming over the town like a shadow cast by the gallows at dawn. And Dodge was not alone. Across the West, towns from Deadwood to Tombstone carried the same scars. Public hangings drew crowds, sometimes thousands strong, men and women who watched as criminals, or alleged criminals, were dropped into eternity. For frontier communities, these events reinforced order in a way trials never could. They were rituals as much as punishments, affirming that the community held power over life and death. Yet they also revealed a darker hunger, a fascination with death that blurred the line between justice and spectacle. As civilization pushed westward, the courts grew stronger, and the gallows grew less common. But the legend of Dodge and its rope endured. Hollywood would one day seize upon it, filling screens with grim-faced sheriffs and outlaws staring down death in dusty towns. The hangman's noose became an icon, as recognizable as the six-gun or the cowboy hat. It symbolized a world where choices were stark, where life was fragile, and where justice, rightly or wrongly, was swift. For the people who had lived it, the memory was more personal. Merchants who had seen mobs gather outside their shops, mothers who had shielded children from the sight of men swinging, lawmen who had given the nod, all carried the weight of those days. They knew that behind the myths and novels was a harsher truth. The rope was never just about justice. It was about survival. It was about fear. It was about a community struggling to hold itself together in a world that seemed determined to tear it apart. Today, Dodge City stands as a quieter place, its wild past preserved in museums and reenactments, its legends retold to visitors who come seeking a taste of the Old West. The gallows are gone, replaced by monuments and plaques. Yet when the prairie wind blows across Boot Hill, one can almost hear the creak of rope and the murmurs of crowds who once gathered to witness justice delivered. The legacy of the noose lives on, not in the rope itself, but in the questions it left behind. Was the rope a necessary evil, the only tool strong enough to hold back chaos in the lawless days of the frontier? Or was it a symbol of fear, a reminder that in Dodge City, justice often bent to the will of the mob? Did it bring civilization to the plains? Or did it expose just how fragile civilization truly was? The answers lie somewhere in between, tangled like the fibers of the noose itself. What remains undeniable is that Dodge City, and towns like it, carved their place in history not just through cattle and commerce, but through the hangman's rope. It was both executioner and storyteller, silencing some voices while echoing others across the decades. And so the story of Dodge's rope is not just a tale of crime and punishment. It is the story of a community wrestling with its own nature, a people caught between the wilderness and the promise of order. It is the story of the American West itself, raw, violent, searching for justice, and forever haunted by the question of what that justice truly cost. What do you think? Was the hangman's rope the frontier's grim necessity, or was it the darkest page in Dodge City's history? Share your thoughts and ride with us again as we uncover more stories of a West where law was fragile, courage was scarce, and justice was written in blood, dust, and hemp.